planners, what's your worst Bridezilla Story 1. I once had a bride who insisted on a unicorn entrance. She wanted to ride a white horse with a fake unicorn horn glued to its head down the aisle. I told her that horses can be unpredictable, especially in loud environments, but she wouldn't hear it. Come wedding day, the horse gets spooked by the music and rears up. The bride falls off, rips her custom $10,000 dress and starts wailing. Instead of making sure she was okay, her first words were, "Did someone get that on video?" She wanted to go viral. Turns out, her whole wedding was designed for social media clout. Fake, candid moments, a staged argument with her maid of honor, even a dramatic fainting spell during the vows. The groom looked miserable the whole time. They divorced 6 months later after she cheated on him with her wedding photographer. Story 2. I had a bride who wanted a winter wonderland wedding. The issue? She was getting married in Florida in June. She demanded we find a way to make it snow. I told her that was impossible unless she wanted a machine that would cost tens of thousands of dollars. Instead, she bought 200 pounds of fake snow and had it dumped everywhere. The problem? It was basically shredded plastic. It got into the air, into people's food, into the cake. It was a mess. To make things worse, she had the thermostat in the venue turned down to 50 degrees to make it feel like winter. People were shivering in their formal wear, and the elderly guests were miserable. When her grandma asked for a shawl, the bride snapped, "This is my vision and I don't care if you freeze." Half the guests left before dinner. The groom looked embarrassed the whole night. That marriage lasted 3 weeks. Story 3. This bride was obsessed with being the star of her wedding. She asked her bridesmaids to sign contracts stating they wouldn't gain or lose more than 5 pounds before the wedding. One of them got pregnant, and the bride flipped out because she didn't want a fat bridesmaid in the photos. Then she told her fiancé's 13-year-old niece she couldn't be a flower girl anymore because she wasn't cute enough. She replaced her with a hired child model. On the big day, she threw a tantrum because her maid of honor's dress wasn't tailored exactly how she wanted. She literally screamed, "You're ruining my day!" and demanded she leave. The best man stepped in and told the groom, "Dude, is this really who you want to marry?" Right there, in front of 200 people, the groom walked out. The bride sat in shock for a second, then tried to continue the wedding anyway with a fake smile. Everyone left. It was glorious. Story 4. This bride was cheap in the worst way possible. She had a big budget, but wanted everything for free. She asked vendors for exposure discounts, tried to get her bridesmaids to pay for their own dresses and hers, and even demanded her guests bring their own food to the reception. The worst part? She hired a wedding planner, me, and then refused to pay. She kept saying, "Oh, we'll settle up after the wedding." I pulled out of the contract a month before and she lost her mind. She left me dozens of angry voicemails, threatened to sue, and even had her fiancé call me crying because she was so stressed. Well, karma hit hard. The caterer, who also hadn't been paid, canceled the morning of the wedding. No food, no drinks, nothing. The bride had a full meltdown, screaming at her guests to go buy pizza or something. Half the guests left, and the rest watched her sit in the middle of the dance floor sobbing into her wine. Story 5. This one still haunts me. The bride was nice at first, but slowly became unhinged. She wanted a 5-tier cake that looked like it was floating. I explained that wasn't structurally possible, and she snapped, "You're just not trying hard enough." She also wanted doves released indoors. I told her that was a bad idea. She did it anyway. The doves immediately flew into the chandeliers, knocking down glass everywhere. One bird pooped on her dress and she started sobbing. Then came the absolute worst part. She demanded a perfect sunset photo. The issue? It was cloudy. She literally turned to me and screamed, "Do something!" like I controlled the weather. The final straw was when she threw her bouquet at her maid of honor. Not tossed. Threw. Full force. Why? Because the maid of honor got engaged a week before the wedding and the bride thought she was stealing the spotlight. The photographer caught the whole thing. The wedding was beautiful, but the guests left whispering about how awful she was. The groom looked dead inside. They lasted 2 months. Story 6. This bride was obsessed with being the center of attention. She told her bridesmaids they weren't allowed to wear makeup, style their hair too nicely, or look better than her in any way. One bridesmaid had a small tattoo on her wrist, and the bride demanded she cover it with makeup because she didn't want it in her photos. But the worst part? The hairstylist refused to do her hair exactly how she wanted because the look wasn't possible with her short, damaged hair. The bride lost it. She started crying, throwing things, and screaming that everyone was trying to ruin her big day. She fired the stylist an hour before the ceremony and made her maid of honor do her hair instead. By the reception, she had a full meltdown because the bridesmaids were getting more compliments than she was. She literally stormed out of her own wedding. The groom had to chase after her while the guests awkwardly stood around wondering if the night was over. Spoiler, the night was, in fact, over. Story 7. This bride hated her future mother-in-law and made it everyone's problem. She didn't invite her to the bridal shower, forced her to wear an ugly brown dress to the wedding, and banned her from sitting in the front row. The groom kept trying to keep the peace, but the bride just got meaner. On the wedding day, the mother-in-law arrived wearing a nice navy dress, nothing crazy. The bride flipped out. She demanded the woman leave or change clothes. The groom had finally had enough. He took the mic before dinner and said, "If you can't respect my family, you don't respect me. I'm done." Then he just walked out. The guests gasped. The bride tried to chase him down, and the entire reception turned into a disaster. Guests started leaving, and the venue staff awkwardly packed up the untouched cake. The kicker? The groom and his mom went out for dinner after. She paid for the whole thing. Story 8. The bride had a beach wedding but didn't want anyone to wear sandals. She forced her entire bridal party to wear heels in the sand. You can probably guess how well that went. Bridesmaids were tripping, guests were sinking, and one poor woman sprained her ankle. Then, she had the audacity to complain that people weren't standing up properly during the ceremony. She paused the wedding to yell, "Can you guys just try to look elegant?" Later, she freaked out when the wind messed up her hair and started sobbing because the sunset wasn't as pretty as she expected. She turned to me and literally said, "Why does the sky look like that?" Mother Nature did not care about her timeline. Story 9. This one still makes me shudder. The bride was a control freak to the max. She sent a 30-page wedding itinerary to everyone, detailing exactly when and where they should be. It had rules for guests, including no plus ones unless she personally approved them, no eating before speeches, not even a bread roll, no posting photos of the wedding until she did first. But here's the kicker. She told her bridesmaids they couldn't get pregnant before the wedding because she didn't want belly bumps in her photos. When one of them announced she was expecting, the bride kicked her out of the wedding party. And just to top it off, she made her maid of honor reschedule her honeymoon so it didn't steal attention from the wedding week. The marriage lasted 4 months. Story 10. This bride didn't just want a wedding. She wanted a royal event. She demanded that guests stand when she entered the room, had her bridesmaids curtsy to her at the rehearsal, and referred to herself as Queen Bride. She even tried to make her flower girl bow before tossing petals. The poor kid was 5. During the reception, she got mad when guests weren't clapping enough and stopped the music to demand a standing ovation for her. When people laughed, she screamed and stormed off. The DJ refused to restart the music until she apologized. She never did. The reception ended early because people started leaving. And the groom? He looked so embarrassed. Last I heard, he left her 3 weeks later. Story 11. This bride treated her wedding like a military operation. She sent color-coded schedules to every guest, had assigned meal portions for each person, and even sent rehearsal scripts so people would know their roles in her wedding. The worst part? She told her bridesmaids that they had to weigh in every 2 weeks leading up to the wedding to maintain their figures. If they gained more than 3 pounds, they were out of the bridal party. One of her bridesmaids, who had just given birth, was kicked out because she wasn't trying hard enough. On the wedding day, she flipped out because the cake was 2 inches shorter than expected. She literally screamed at the baker and refused to take pictures with the cake unless they found a way to make it look taller. And guess what? After all that effort, the marriage lasted 6 weeks. The groom moved out because he felt like her employee, not her husband. Story 12. The bride wanted an outdoor garden wedding, but she was terrified of bugs. She made the venue spray pesticides everywhere, which didn't just kill the bugs, it killed the flowers too. The once beautiful garden looked dead on her wedding day. She threw a tantrum and blamed everyone but herself. But that wasn't the worst part. She demanded that guests check their food for insects before eating. Every few minutes, she would pause her meal to shriek and accuse a server of letting a bug near her. At one point, she even fainted dramatically when she thought a fly landed in her wine. By the end of the night, people were over it. The groom looked miserable. The guests started placing bets on how long the marriage would last. Final result? 2 months. Story 13. This bride planned the pettiest wedding ever. She deliberately scheduled her wedding on the exact date of her sister's anniversary on purpose. She said she wanted the day to mean something, and then told her sister, "Well, it's my anniversary now." She also had all of her bridesmaids wear dresses in colors that they hated, just so she could stand out. One bridesmaid looked amazing in blue, so she forced her to wear orange. Another had a favorite dress style, so the bride banned that cut from the wedding. But her biggest meltdown happened when her cousin got engaged 2 weeks before the wedding. The bride sent a mass email to her guests, saying, "Anyone who talks about another wedding during my event will be asked to leave." When the cousin congratulated her on her big day, the bride snapped, "Oh, so you're making this about you now?" They haven't spoken since. Story 14. The bride was so obsessed with her dream dress that she spent $15,000 on it. The problem? The groom had been saving up for a house, and she secretly used their house fund to pay for it. He didn't find out until the week before the wedding. When he confronted her, she said, "A wedding is more important than a house," he told her. "Then you can marry the dress because I'm out." She begged him to stay, but he was done. Instead of canceling the wedding, she went ahead with a fake one just for the pictures. She invited guests, never told them the groom wasn't coming, and just posed with her bridesmaids the whole time. She even cut a cake by herself and pretended the groom was running late. Eventually, people caught on and left confused. Last I heard, she still posts wedding memories on Instagram like the marriage actually happened. Story 15. This bride went full diva mode over her first dance. She wanted to do a surprise performance with her groom, complete with choreography, fog machines, and backup dancers. The groom? He had 2 left feet and didn't want to do it. She forced him anyway. He tried his best, but he kept messing up, and she flipped out. In the middle of the dance, she stopped the music, grabbed the mic, and shamed her husband in front of 200 people. "I told him to practice, but he's been lazy." Then she made the DJ restart the dance, with just her dancing alone. The groom just walked off the dance floor. He didn't even stay for the reception. The guests awkwardly clapped while she finished her routine alone. They got an annulment 3 days later. Story 16. This bride wanted a completely silent wedding ceremony. No talking, no laughing, no babies crying, nothing. She actually hired security to escort out anyone who made a noise. Well, 5 minutes in, a baby let out a small giggle. The bride froze mid-vow, turned to glare at the baby's mom, and snapped her fingers at security. The mother tried to whisper an apology, but security was already grabbing her by the arm to remove her. The groom looked horrified, and a few guests protested, saying, "Are you serious? It's just a baby." The bride huffed, "Rules are rules." That was the beginning of the end. Half the guests walked out in protest. The groom? He didn't even finish his vows. He just stood there, shook his head, and left the altar. They never made it to the reception. Story 17. The bride wanted an exotic animal wedding. Her dream? A live tiger at the reception. She said it would make the wedding look classy and dangerous. Every single vendor refused. She finally found some shady company willing to rent her a sedated tiger for photos. Come wedding day, the tiger was terrified. The guests were uncomfortable, and the bride forced people to take pictures near it. At one point, the tiger growled at a bridesmaid who got too close, and the girl screamed. The tiger freaked out and tried to escape. Cue full-on chaos. Guests ran for their lives, tables got knocked over, and the bride was crying hysterically because the tiger photos were ruined. The groom? He was done. He yelled, "This is insane!" and walked out. Last I heard, she's banned from the venue for life. Story 18. This bride hated her brother's girlfriend and went to insane lengths to keep her out of the wedding. She originally didn't invite her, but when her brother threatened to drop out as best man, she allowed it. But here's where it gets crazy. She switched the girlfriend's dinner to a kid's meal on purpose. She gave everyone filet mignon and salmon, except the girlfriend, who got chicken nuggets. The girlfriend? She laughed it off and started eating her nuggets like a champ. But the brother? He was pissed. He called the bride out in front of everyone. The bride tried to act innocent, but the caterer admitted she specifically ordered a child's plate for her. The groom's face went white, and he asked, "Did you really do that?" The bride doubled down and said, "Well, she's not family, so who cares?" The groom stood up, said, "I can't do this," and just left. The wedding ended right there. Story 19. The bride demanded that all of her bridesmaids dye their hair the same color so no one would clash with the theme. One of them refused because she had naturally red hair and didn't want to ruin it. The bride freaked out and said, "Fine, then you just won't be in the pictures." The girl assumed she meant no formal portraits. Nope. The bride actually instructed the photographer to crop her out of every single candid shot. Like, even group photos? She was edited out. When she saw the wedding album, she was shocked. It was like she was never there. The bride told her, "Well, I warned you." She cut the bride off completely after that. And the groom? He admitted later, "Yeah, I should have seen the red flags." Story 20. This bride treated her wedding like a reality TV show. She set up a confessional booth where guests could record messages about how amazing she was. Not about the couple, just her. She even hired a film crew to follow her around all day, barking orders at them like she was a celebrity. But her biggest demand? She wanted a dramatic moment for the cameras. She orchestrated a fake fight with her maid of honor, on purpose. She accused her of ruining her day and forced her to leave mid-reception. The poor girl was in tears. The groom? He had no idea this was staged. He found out later and was livid. He refused to sign the wedding video release, so the whole production was pointless. They were divorced before the video was even edited. Story 21. This bride was obsessed with looking angelic on her wedding day. She wanted pure white everything. White roses, white doves, and a strict all-white dress code. That meant everyone, including guests, had to wear head-to-toe white. One guest, a pregnant woman, didn't feel comfortable wearing white, so she showed up in a soft blush pink dress. The bride immediately noticed and freaked out. She stopped the ceremony mid-processional and said, "Excuse me, but you need to leave. You're ruining the aesthetic." The poor woman was humiliated and tried to apologize, but the bride wouldn't budge. Her exact words, "I specifically said white. If you can't follow instructions, you don't belong here." The groom tried to intervene, but the bride just snapped, "Are you on my side or hers?" That was his break. He took a deep breath and said, "If this is who you really are, I'm done." Then, in front of 200 guests, he walked out. Story 22. This bride hated her future sister-in-law and did everything she could to make her miserable leading up to the wedding. She made her buy an ugly dress, refused to let her be in any pre-wedding photos, and even told the makeup artist to tone her down so she wouldn't outshine her. The final straw? The bride had assigned seating and put the sister-in-law at the kids' table. Not only was she furious, but so was the groom. He immediately noticed, got up, and dragged a chair over to the family table. The bride hissed, "She's supposed to be over there." The groom stood up, raised his glass, and said, "To my family." Then he paused, looked at the bride and said, "Well, my actual family?" The bride turned beet red. That was the start of the downfall. They lasted 6 months before he left her. Story 23. The bride was obsessed with Disney and wanted a fairy tale wedding. Nothing wrong with that, except she took it way too far. She forced her bridesmaids to wear full princess gowns with corsets and tiaras. She made the groom and his groomsmen wear tights, like literal Prince Charming outfits. The groom's best man refused and tried to wear a regular suit. She kicked him out of the wedding. Then she demanded that guests refer to her as Her Royal Highness the entire night. If someone called her by her real name, she ignored them. But the worst part? She had a full-on temper tantrum when the horse-drawn carriage she wanted wasn't available. She literally laid down in her wedding dress on the floor, sobbing, until the groom had to beg her to get up. Everyone at the wedding cringed. The groom looked miserable in his ridiculous outfit, and the marriage barely lasted a year. Story 24. This bride didn't just want a wedding, she wanted a performance. She actually wrote a script for the bridal party to follow. The best man's speech? She wrote it. The vows? She wrote both of them. She even tried to force the groom's mom to cry on cue, so the wedding video would be cinematic. She literally handed her a tissue and said, "You should start crying here." The mom refused, and the bride snapped, "Can you at least look emotional?" Then came the first dance. She insisted that she and the groom perform a fully choreographed routine. The groom wasn't comfortable with it, so she hired a professional dancer and did the entire thing without him. The guests were confused. The groom was embarrassed. By the time the night ended, he realized he had just married a narcissist. They lasted 2 months. Story 25. This bride had an insane budget but was cheap in all the wrong ways. She spent $20,000 on her dress but refused to pay for catering. Instead, she told guests to bring their own meals. She literally wrote in the invitations, "Potluck-style reception. Bring your best dish." People thought she was joking. She was not. Come wedding day, the venue looked stunning. But the buffet table was bare because most guests didn't bring anything. The bride freaked out and started begging people to go out and buy food. When the groom's mom suggested ordering pizza, the bride screamed, "This isn't a college party." Half the guests left early. The groom was so embarrassed that he spent his wedding night at his best man's house. They were divorced before their first anniversary. Story 26. This bride was obsessed with her wedding dress and wanted to make sure no other woman looked better than her. She banned all female guests from wearing makeup and even sent a dress code saying, "No dresses tighter than mine, no heels taller than mine, and no hairstyle fancier than mine." She even handed out drugstore foundation at the entrance and demanded women dull down their faces if they had makeup. One of the bridesmaids, a professional makeup artist, refused, and the bride screamed, "You're stealing my spotlight," before kicking her out of the wedding. By the time the reception started, most women had left out of pure frustration. The remaining guests were silent and uncomfortable. The groom? He looked exhausted. They didn't even make it to the honeymoon. He filed for an annulment within a week. Story 27. This bride treated her wedding like a corporate event. She literally sent out a PowerPoint presentation months before the wedding, explaining the rules. "No one is allowed to drink before I give my speech. Clapping must last at least 10 seconds after every toast. Nobody else may wear white. Even men in white dress shirts must wear a jacket. The worst part? She scheduled a wedding test the week before, where guests had to answer questions about her and the groom. If they failed the quiz, they weren't allowed in the first row. Guests were so annoyed that some just didn't show up. The groom was so embarrassed by the whole thing that he got drunk before the ceremony just to deal with it. By the end of the night, he was sitting alone at the bar while she yelled at the DJ for not playing the right mix of songs. They were divorced within 4 months. Story 28. This bride wanted a royal wedding but didn't have a royal budget. She expected vendors to work for free and even tried to negotiate exposure deals. She refused to pay her wedding photographer, saying, "You should be honored to capture my wedding." She also tried to scam the florist by saying she only needed samples and then ghosting them when they asked for payment. Then, she had the audacity to invite guests but charge them per plate. She literally had a ticket system at the reception, where if you didn't buy a plate in advance, you weren't allowed to eat. Her own family refused to pay, and she screamed at them for being selfish. Most of the guests left early without eating, and the groom looked like he wanted to disappear. They didn't last a year. The groom ended up marrying a waitress from the reception. Story 29. This bride was obsessed with astrology and tried to plan her entire wedding around the perfect celestial alignment. She delayed the wedding 3 times because Mercury was in retrograde. She even hired an astrologer to approve all major wedding decisions. At one point, she forced the officiant to change the timing of the vows by 15 minutes because Saturn's energy needed to be just right. Then came the craziest part. She demanded that guests sit in zodiac-appropriate sections at the reception. She literally had a seating chart where Aries guests had to sit far from Capricorn guests because she thought they'd clash. The groom? He wasn't into astrology at all. By the time she started planning their future kids' birthdays based on star charts, he realized he had made a mistake. He filed for divorce on a full moon, just to be petty. Story 30. This bride had a meltdown over the bouquet toss. She wanted it to be a magical moment where all the single women fought for the bouquet like in movies, but nobody wanted to catch it. She literally had to force women onto the dance, and when she tossed the bouquet, no one grabbed it. It just hit the She was so embarrassed that she grabbed the mic and screamed at her bridesmaids for ruining the moment. She then forced one of them to pick it up and pose with it. The DJ tried to move on, but she kept pouting the rest of the night. The groom looked so done. By the next morning, he had already texted his best man saying he regretted everything. The marriage lasted 6 weeks. Story 31. This bride was obsessed with having the perfect wedding video. She wanted it to look like a Hollywood movie, so she hired a film director instead of a normal wedding videographer. She made her bridesmaids reshoot their entrance down the aisle 3 times because the first 2 takes weren't cinematic enough. The officiant tried to move forward with the vows, but she stopped him mid-sentence to say, "Wait, we need better lighting." But the craziest part? She faked her own surprised reaction when she saw the groom, making him turn around so they could redo their first look. The guests were so over it, and the groom. He looked exhausted. By the time the reception started, people joked that the wedding should be titled Bridezilla, the movie. The groom later admitted that watching the wedding footage made him realize he married a director, not a wife. They divorced within 3 months. Story 32. This bride was a control freak. She banned smiling in photos because she wanted a Vogue magazine aesthetic. She literally sent out a memo before the wedding saying, "No smiling, no laughing, and no silly poses." She hired a photo assistant to walk around and scold people if they dared to smile for the camera. Then, at the reception, she yelled at her own father for laughing too loudly during the toast. Her words? "This is supposed to be elegant, not a frat party." The groom was so uncomfortable. After the wedding, when they got the pictures back, he told her, "You sucked all the joy out of our own wedding." Guess what? He left her before they even got the album printed. Story 33. This bride wanted a dramatic entrance for the reception and decided that she and the groom would arrive in separate helicopters. Yes, helicopters. She spent so much money on this that she cut the catering budget. Instead of actual food, she served guests crackers, cheese cubes, and champagne. People were starving, and when guests started ordering pizza, she lost it. She stood on a chair and screamed, "This is a luxury event, not a pizza party." Her mother-in-law rolled her eyes and paid for 20 pizzas to be delivered anyway. The groom? He whispered to his best man, "What have I done?" They lasted 2 months before he filed for divorce. Story 34. This bride wanted her wedding to go viral. She kept saying she wanted a trending moment that would make it onto Instagram and TikTok. Her first idea? Releasing hundreds of butterflies after they said, "I do." Sounds pretty, right? Except the butterflies were still in their cocoons and didn't hatch in time. So instead of a magical moment, she ended up dumping a box of dead butterflies onto the grass. Her backup plan? She wanted someone to accidentally fall into the wedding cake so it would look funny on video. She tried to bribe her cousin into pretending to slip and faceplant into the cake. When he refused, she snapped, "Ugh, you're ruining my viral moment." At the reception, she spent the whole night glued to her phone, checking social media instead of talking to guests. The groom? He barely spoke to her. The marriage ended when she posted a dramatic breakup announcement video just to get views. Story 35. This bride had a meltdown over the flower girl. She wanted a tiny, adorable flower, but her cousin's daughter hit a growth spurt before the wedding and was now a few inches taller. Instead of accepting it, the bride fired the flower girl and tried to hire a smaller child. When her family refused, she actually asked the flower girl's mom if she could make her slouch to look smaller in photos. On the wedding day, the little girl was so nervous that she started walking too slowly down the aisle. The bride whisper yelled, "Hurry up!" The kid got scared, tripped over her dress, and fell. Instead of helping her, the bride groaned in frustration and said, "Ugh, just get up." The entire family was disgusted. The groom's mother called her out at the reception, saying, "If this is how you treat a child, I don't even want to know how you treat my son." That marriage didn't last a year. Story 36. This bride banned glasses at her wedding because she thought they looked ugly in photos. She told her guests, including her own father, that if they wore glasses, they had to take them off for all pictures. One of the bridesmaids had a strong prescription and said she literally couldn't function without them. The bride rolled her eyes and said, "Just squint, it's not that hard." On the wedding day, the father of the bride walked her down the aisle without his glasses and tripped on her dress. He nearly fell into the altar, knocking over some decorations. Instead of checking if he was okay, the bride was furious. She whisper-screamed at him to not ruin my moment. At the reception, when she saw a guest still wearing glasses, she made a bridesmaid take them off him and hide them. The guest got so angry he left early. The groom? He started realizing how ridiculous she was. They were divorced before their first anniversary. Story 37. This bride wanted a completely child-free wedding, which is totally fine, except she waited until the last second to tell people. She sent a message the night before saying, "Reminder, no kids allowed. If you bring a child, you'll be turned away at the door." A lot of guests had no time to find babysitters, and some assumed she was joking. One couple showed up with their 6-month-old baby, thinking it wouldn't be a big deal. The bride? She stopped everything, right at the entrance, and refused to let them in. The couple begged, saying they'd keep the baby quiet. But the bride started crying and told security to escort them out. The groom? He was humiliated. His own sister was the one being thrown out, and he had no idea she was coming with her baby because the bride never told him about the rule. The sister didn't speak to the bride for 2 years. The marriage didn't last even one. Story 38. This bride wanted a glamorous wedding entrance. She planned to walk down a staircase with a long flowing cape attached to her dress so she looked like a queen. But she wanted it to be so dramatic that she hired a wind machine. Yes, a literal industrial fan to make the cape billow behind her. The problem? It was way too powerful. As she walked down the stairs, the wind hit her dress too hard and sent her veil flying off her head. The cape got tangled in her shoes. She tripped, tumbled halfway down the stairs, and landed right on her stomach in front of everyone. Instead of laughing it off, she threw a fit. She blamed the venue, the dressmaker, even the wind. She refused to continue the ceremony until she felt like a queen again. The groom? He had to beg her to just move on. The guests? Mortified. They lasted 7 months. Story 39. This bride wanted her guests to fund her honeymoon. She sent out a GoFundMe link with her wedding invites, saying, "Instead of gifts, just contribute to our dream trip." But that wasn't enough. She tracked donations and actually ranked her guests based on how much they gave. At the reception, she had a thank you board, where she listed people's names and how much they contributed. The ones who gave the least? Their names were in small print at the bottom. When someone confronted her about it, she smirked and said, "Well, if people cared about us, they'd show it." The groom? He had no idea she even made that. He was so embarrassed that he apologized to multiple guests. They made it to the honeymoon, but he filed for divorce the day they got back. Story 40. This bride was so obsessed with being the center of attention that she sabotaged her own bridesmaids. She told them they could pick their own dresses, but when she saw them looking too good, she secretly switched their dresses at the last second. The night before the wedding, she handed them new dresses, all a size too small, in an ugly color, and super uncomfortable. When they complained, she played dumb and said, "Oh no, I must have mixed up the sizes." One bridesmaid had enough and refused to wear it. The bride screamed at her and kicked her out of the wedding at 2 a.m. At the wedding, the remaining bridesmaids were miserable. They looked uncomfortable, stiff, and exhausted. The guests noticed. The groom noticed too. Later, he found out the truth and said, "That's the pettiest thing I've ever heard." The marriage lasted 5 months. Story 41. This bride wanted a completely pure white wedding, and that included the guests. No, not just their outfits, their hair. She sent out a message 2 months before the wedding saying, anyone with brightly colored hair, pink, blue, green, etc., must dye it back to a natural color before the wedding day. It'll ruin the aesthetic otherwise. One of her bridesmaids, who had vibrant red hair since birth, thought the message didn't apply to her. She was wrong. The bride pulled her aside at the rehearsal and said, "You're going to have to dye that or wear a wig. I don't want any distractions in my photos." The bridesmaid walked out and quit on the spot. The bride was furious and spent the rest of the night bad-mouthing her for being selfish. The best part? Karma hit fast. On the wedding day, a kid spilled red punch all over the bride's dress. Guests whispered that it was the bridesmaid's ghost getting revenge. The marriage didn't even last a year. Story 42. This bride wanted her wedding to be a full-blown red carpet event. She forced every guest to go through a fashion check at the entrance. She hired a wedding bouncer to inspect people's outfits and make sure they met her dress code. Anyone who didn't was either denied entry or told to go home and change. One guest, an elderly woman, was wearing a floral dress instead of the required solid neutral tones. The bride told her, "Either find a backup dress or you can't come in." The woman? Her own grandmother. The groom was horrified and said, "She's my family and she's staying." The bride tried to argue, but the groom shut her down and escorted his grandma inside himself. That was the beginning of the end. They lasted 4 months. Story 43. This bride wanted perfect bridesmaids, so she made them take a fitness challenge. She gave them strict diet plans and mandatory weekly weigh-ins. One bridesmaid, who had just given birth, was struggling to lose weight fast enough. The bride pulled her aside and said, "I'm sorry, but you're just not wedding ready. I need my bridal party to match." The bridesmaid burst into tears and quit. Instead of feeling bad, the bride told the remaining bridesmaids, "At least now the photos will look better." Karma came fast. On the wedding day, her custom-fitted dress ripped down the back right before she walked down the aisle. The wedding was delayed for 2 hours while she cried and threw a tantrum. The groom? He looked exhausted. They were divorced within a year. Story 44. This bride wanted a destination wedding in the Caribbean, but instead of paying for anything, she forced guests to cover all the costs. She booked an all-inclusive resort and then demanded guests pay for their own rooms. If they didn't book at her chosen hotel, they weren't allowed to come. She even tried to charge people extra for the wedding experience. If they wanted to attend the rehearsal dinner, the farewell brunch, or any other event, they had to pay a separate fee. One guest, her own cousin, called her out and said, "Why are we paying to celebrate you?" The bride kicked her out of the wedding and told the other guests, "If you can't afford it, you don't deserve to be here." Half the guests canceled their trips. The wedding was half empty. The groom's family didn't even show up. They lasted 6 months. Story 45. This bride wanted a horse-drawn carriage entrance for her big day. The problem? She had never been on a horse in her life. The wedding planner tried to warn her that a loud, crowded event wasn't ideal for an inexperienced rider. She ignored the advice. On the wedding day, she tried to mount the horse in her heavy dress. The horse got spooked. She barely got into the saddle before it started bucking. She screamed as it took off down the road with her still clinging on. By the time they got the horse under control, her dress was covered in dirt, her veil was missing, and she was in tears. Instead of laughing it off, she blamed the groom for not stopping it. He said, "How the hell was I supposed to stop a horse?" That turned into a huge fight. They argued through the entire reception. They were divorced before the wedding video was even edited. Story 46. This bride wanted an all-vegan wedding, which was fine, until she forced her guests to follow suit. She banned all animal products, including leather shoes, wool dresses, and even silk ties. She had a vegan checkpoint at the entrance where guests were inspected before being allowed inside. Her uncle, who had leather dress shoes, was told to either take them off or leave. When he refused, she threw a tantrum and accused him of disrespecting her values. But the worst part? She snuck fake meat into the food and lied to guests about it. A few people who had severe soy allergies got sick. When confronted, she laughed it off and said, "Now you know plant-based food isn't so bad." The groom was horrified. After their honeymoon, he apologized to every guest individually and told them, "I should have called it off." They were divorced in 5 months. Story 47. This bride wanted her wedding to be aesthetic and moody, which meant no smiling allowed. She told guests that if they were caught smiling in photos, they'd be photoshopped out. She wanted everything to look dramatic and high fashion. Her father, a naturally happy guy, he kept grinning during the ceremony, and she snapped at him under her breath. When she got the wedding album back, she had him removed from multiple pictures. He found out when he saw the photos and said, "Why am I missing from half of these?" She shrugged and said, "You were ruining the mood." The groom? He started noticing how controlling she was. They lasted 4 months. Story 48. This bride didn't just want a first dance, she wanted a full Broadway performance. She hired choreographers, backup dancers, and even a fog machine. The problem? The groom had 2 left feet and wanted a simple slow dance. She forced him into weeks of rehearsals and yelled at him whenever he missed a step. At one point, she even threatened to replace him with her dance instructor, just for the performance. On the wedding day, he froze mid-dance and walked off the floor. The bride kept dancing solo, pretending everything was fine while guests awkwardly clapped. He later told his best man, "I felt like a prop, not a husband." The marriage didn't last a year. Story 49. This bride rigged the bouquet toss. She told her best friend she would hand her the bouquet instead of throwing it, because she wanted her to be the next to get married. But at the last second, she changed her mind and threw it directly at her younger sister. The best friend was visibly upset, and when she asked why, the bride smirked and said, "Well, you've been engaged for 3 years with no wedding. Maybe you're not meant to be next." The friend left the reception early. The groom noticed how cruel she was. The next day, he said, "If you treat your best friend like that, how will you treat me in a few years?" He filed for divorce within 6 months. Story 50. This bride wanted a movie moment exit with fireworks, a horse-drawn carriage, and a full marching band. The problem? The venue had strict noise restrictions. She ignored them. At midnight, she had a live brass band march into the venue and start playing at full volume. The venue manager ran over and told her they had 5 minutes to shut it down or the police would be called. She screamed at the staff, yelling, "This is my night! You can't ruin it!" Sure enough, the police arrived. The wedding ended with her arguing with officers while guests awkwardly shuffled out. The groom? Humiliated. He later admitted, "That was the moment I knew I made a mistake." They lasted 3 months. Story 51. This bride was obsessed with looking flawless in every wedding photo. She hired a professional lighting crew just for her portraits and banned guests from taking their own pictures so no one could capture her at a bad angle. She even sent her bridesmaids to get facials and hair treatments, but made them sign a contract that said they couldn't change their appearance before the wedding. That meant no haircuts, no weight loss, no weight gain. One bridesmaid got a small haircut 2 weeks before the wedding, and the bride threw a tantrum. She removed her from the bridal party and told her, "I can't have you ruining the symmetry of my pictures." The final straw? She edited every guest's face in the wedding album so she would be the prettiest person in every shot. The groom didn't realize how crazy she was until he saw the photos. He later said, "She didn't just Photoshop the wedding, she Photoshopped our entire marriage." They were divorced in 4 months. Story 52. This bride wanted a picture-perfect, Instagram-worthy wedding, so she hired actors to fill empty seats. Some guests had canceled last minute, and instead of accepting it, she hired fake guests to sit in their places and pretend to be friends. She even gave them fake names and backstories so no one would notice. The groom's mother tried to talk to one of them, and he panicked and ran to the bathroom. When the groom found out, he was furious. His exact words? "You turned our wedding into a reality show." The marriage lasted less than 6 months. Story 53. This bride demanded a surprise proposal at her own wedding. Not for herself, for her maid of honor. She pressured the maid of honor's boyfriend into proposing at the reception, saying it would be a beautiful moment that would make the wedding go viral. The boyfriend? Not ready to propose. When he refused, the bride flipped out and accused him of ruining the mood. Then, she tried to stage the proposal anyway by handing him a ring box during a toast and saying, "Now would be a perfect time, don't you think?" The guy looked horrified. The maid of honor was furious and stormed out. The groom? Mortified. He later admitted, "I should have known when she started planning other people's engagements at our wedding." They lasted 5 months. Story 54. This bride didn't just have a Bridezilla meltdown, she had a full-on screaming match with a guest. Her younger cousin had recently had a baby and showed up to the wedding looking fantastic. She'd lost a lot of baby weight, and people were complimenting her. The bride? Livid. She accused her cousin of stealing her thunder and demanded she change dresses. When the cousin refused, the bride grabbed a glass of wine and dumped it on it. The family was horrified. The cousin left in tears. The groom didn't even bother defending her. He just stood there, shaking his head. That marriage didn't even last a year. Story 55. This bride wanted to be carried down the aisle, literally. She hired 4 men to carry her on a golden throne while a choir sang. The problem? The venue had a long, narrow aisle, and the guys struggled to balance her. Halfway down, they lost their grip. She fell off the throne, right onto her expensive custom dress. The dress ripped, her crown flew off, and she landed in the aisle in front of everyone. Instead of laughing it off, she started screaming at the guys, crying that they ruined her grand entrance. She refused to walk the rest of the way and demanded they reset everything so she could do it over. The groom looked done. His best man later said, "That was the moment we all knew the marriage wouldn't last." They lasted 6 months. Story 56. This bride had one rule for her wedding. No one was allowed to wear the color blue. Why? Because she didn't want anyone matching her sapphire engagement. She sent out reminders leading up to the wedding saying, "If you show up in blue, you'll be turned away." The problem? Her own mother had already bought a navy dress. She told the bride she wasn't changing it because it was expensive and custom-made. Come wedding day, the bride saw her mom in blue and lost her mind. She threw a fit right before walking down the aisle and demanded she leave. Her dad tried to step in, but she snapped at him too. Eventually, the mom said, "You know what? Fine, we're leaving." And both parents walked out before the ceremony even started. The groom? Embarrassed beyond belief. The guests? Shocked. The marriage? Didn't survive the honeymoon. Story 57. This bride wanted a wedding gift registry, but with a twist. Instead of normal gifts, she only accepted cash gifts over $500. She literally put a minimum spending requirement on her wedding. She sent out an Excel sheet that listed different tiers of gifts. $500 equals a thank you card. $1,000 equals a seat near the dance. $2,500 equals a personal thank you during the reception. $5,000 plus equals a private dinner with the bride and groom after the honeymoon. Guests were outraged. Some declined the invite on the spot. When people started canceling, she called them out on Facebook saying, "If you can't support us, don't expect an invite to our future events." The groom? Mortified. The marriage? Didn't even last a year. Story 58. This bride had a weird request for her bridesmaids. No one could wear makeup except her. She wanted to be the most naturally beautiful person in every picture. So she banned foundation, mascara, and lipstick for all the bridesmaids. One bridesmaid, who had severe acne, said she wasn't comfortable going makeup-free. The bride didn't care. She told her, "You can either follow the rule or drop out." The bridesmaid dropped out. Come wedding day, the other bridesmaids looked miserable. They had bags under their eyes, chapped lips, and unstyled brows. The guests noticed. The best part? The photographer accidentally caught the groom rolling his eyes at her during the vows. The marriage didn't last 6 months. Story 59. This bride wanted a winter wonderland wedding in the middle of July. She told the venue she wanted fake snow and an ice sculpture centerpiece. The problem? The venue was outdoors and it was 90 degrees. The fake snow melted into a slushy mess. The ice sculpture collapsed halfway through the ceremony, and guests were sweating through their clothes. Instead of accepting reality, she yelled at the staff for not keeping the ice colder. By the reception, she was furious that guests weren't dancing enough because they were too hot. Her solution? She grabbed a microphone and shouted, "Everyone get on the dance floor right now or you're being rude." The groom tried to calm her down. She snapped at him in front of everyone. They were divorced within 3 months. Story 60. This bride faked a medical emergency at her own wedding. She wanted a tear-jerking moment that people would remember, so she pretended to faint during her vows. The problem? Her timing was off. The officiant was in the middle of speaking when she suddenly clutched her chest and dramatically collapsed. People rushed to help her, and someone even called 911. The groom was panicked, but her maid of honor noticed something was off. She whispered, "Are you okay?" and the bride winked at her. That's when the truth came out. When paramedics arrived, she suddenly recovered and said she just needed a drink of water. The groom? Livid. The guests? Disgusted. The marriage? Didn't survive the honeymoon.